We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The McGeough Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So I'm Dr. Heather Igloliorte. I'm one of the co-editors of this new volume, which is many, many years in the making, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. And so we're thrilled to have this text finally solidly in our hands after so long. This is my colleague, Dr. Carla Taunton, the co-editor of the volume. Carla and I actually met on the first day of grad school in our master's degrees in 2004. 2004. And you know what we said, the opening line of the book is that this is the book that we wish we'd had when we were in grad school, trying to figure out how to do this work and how to sort of position ourselves and what we were working through. So we're really, really grateful to all the contributors to the text. We want to begin with our thank yous. There are 44 contributors to this book. There were actually supposed to be over 50. We did lose some people because of the pandemic stressors of child and elder and home care and community responsibilities. So there are, there's going to be gaps in a textbook about Indigenous peoples in North America because there are hundreds of communities. But even that said, we're so grateful to the people who were able to contribute and to those who wanted to contribute. We're especially grateful to Hans, who has been the coordinator of the book for the last couple of years. Contributed to the book, you've received 600 or 700 emails from Hans over the last couple of years. And he's just an incredibly organized and wonderful and gracious cat herder for all this time, so we're deeply grateful to him. Tim Pearson was our lead copy editor. We also had some assistance from Marie Leader on a number of the chapters. Tim also did the index. He's been incredible to work with. Highly, highly recommend. Research assistants have been several people with related projects, but specific to this one, Seppi Day, Eg Tajari, Amy Prouty, Lindsay LeBlanc, and Amanda Shore were all working on this project over a variety of years. Like I said, it started before the pandemic, and then it was put way on hold, and then it ramped up again in the end. And so these are students most of them have gone on and graduated by now. Postdoctoral fellow Dr. Reilley Bishop-Stall was involved throughout part of the early organization of the book, and then was handed off to Hans. So I'm quite delighted to do so when she moved into her now LTA appointment here in the university. Danielle Miles, where's Danny? As always, is just the right hand that keeps everything moving. Infinite contributions. At Routledge, Katie Armstrong's the person that we worked with the most in the beginning. We're really grateful to her. Of course, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada was a supporter throughout this project on various projects that people were talking about, as well as for the book itself. Inuit Futures and Arts Leadership Partnership Grant, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Gail and Stephen A. Jaroslawski Institute for Studies in Canadian Art supported the seed of this project that would grow into the book, Concordia University and NSCAD University. Turn over to you, Carla.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? We're good?
Yeah.
I am Dr. Carla Taunton. I'm joining you from Chibuktuk, Halifax in Mi'kmaq, Nova Scotia. And I'm Associate Professor of Art History and Contemporary Culture at NSCAD University. I wish I could be with you in person, but I'm glad to be joining you from my living room.
All right, so now we'd like to invite all of the panelists to come and join us here. We're going to have a conversation. We're very fortunate that we have a number of local contributors who are here to talk about their chapters with us today.
I'm delighted to introduce our incredible contributors today. I'm going to start with Dr. Michelle McGeough, who contributed Beyond Queer Survivance. Dr. Michelle McGeough, Métis art historian, artist, curator, and associate professor of art history at Concordia University. She holds an MA from Carleton University and a PhD from University of New Mexico. McGeough's research interests have focused on contemporary and historical Indigenous cultural production and Indigenous non-binary identities. This has included an examination of Indigenous understanding of the erotic through the paintings of Norval Morrisseau. Her essay, Norval Morrisseau and the Erotic, was published in Drew Hayden Taylor's anthology, Me Sexy, in 2008. McGeough has curated several exhibitions, including They Gather, Together in One Place in 2015, Beyond Recognition, Aboriginal Abstraction in 2014, both at the Indigenous Art Centre in Gatineau Hall, Quebec. Good morning, Michelle.
Reilley Bishop-Stall, next to Michelle, has co-authored with Heather Campbell, who is the Director of Artist Services at the Inuit Art Foundation and a former Library and Archives Canada archivist, which featured in the essay. They've co-authored a text called An Inuit Approach to Archival Work Based on Respect and Adaptability. Dr. Reilley Bishop-Stall is a settler Canadian art historian whose research is centered on Indigenous and settler representational histories, with a specific focus on historical and contemporary photography and anti-colonial and activist art. She received the 2018 Arts Insights Dissertation Award for McGill University's Best Dissertation in the Humanities, and her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals, including Photography and Culture and Art Journal Open, the Journal of Art Theory and Practice. Having recently completed a Horizon postdoctoral fellowship with Inuit Futures in Arts Leadership, the Pilimik Sarnik Project, Dr. Bishop-Stall is currently, this is actually from the book, you were the scholar in residence at the Department of Art History, and now you are the limited term appointment scholar, and hopefully maybe some other job in the future as well. Jonathan's next, Carla.
Yeah, great. Jonathan Lainey, who contributed Telling the Stories of Objects in Museum Collections, Some Thoughts and Approaches. Jonathan Lainey, Huron-Wendat, Curator of Indigenous Cultures at the McFord Museum in Montreal, the first Indigenous person to hold the position. Previously, Lainey worked as Curator First Peoples at the Canadian Museum of History and as an archivist in Indigenous Archives at Library and Archive Canada. He is known for his scholarship on the heritage and material culture of Indigenous peoples, particularly his knowledge of wampum and the Huron-Wendat. He is the author of La Monnaie des Sauvages, Les Colliers de Wampum d'hier à aujourd'hui, 2004, and an authoritative book on wampum, and I would definitely concur that. Lainey has a background in anthropology and Aboriginal studies and holds a master's degree in history from Laval University.
Hawaiian Samoan scholar Jason Edward Lewis is a digital media poet, artist, software designer, Concordia University Research Chair in Computational Media and the Indigenous Future Imaginary, as well as a professor of computational arts at Concordia University. He co-founded OBX Laboratory for Experimental Media, where he directs projects exploring computational as a creative and cultural material. Along with artist Skawanati, he co-directs Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, Skins workshops on Aboriginal storytelling and video game design, and the Initiative for Indigenous Futures. Lewis's creative work has been featured in Ars Electronica, Mobile Fest, Electra, Urban Screens, ISEA, SIGGRAPH, and File, among other venues, and has been recognized with the inaugural Robert Coover Award for Best Work of Electronic Literature, a Prix Ars Electronica Honorable Mention, and several Imaginative Best New Media Awards and 6 solo exhibitions. He is the lead author of the award-winning Making Kin with Machines, which you should all read, it's online and free, essay and editor of the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence position paper, and we are co-directors of the Indigenous Futures Research Center, which is why we're all here today. And it occurs to me that this is a perfect panel for this book, because we have a curator art historian, we got an art historian and a collaborator, we have a museums professional and a practitioner scholar, and it's kind of what the book is. It's like all these different kinds of contributions, so that's super exciting. Carla, do you want to go with question 1?
Sure. This is obviously for everyone to consider, and the way that we as co-editors framed this book is the idea that the book we wish we'd had at the beginning of our careers. And this is how we pitched it to all the contributors, to you. And we were wondering, how does your essay address something you wish you'd known going into your professional or academic research? And Michelle, would you like to start? Or whomever.
She is on the end. Carla can't see your face, so.
I can see the lovely backs of your head. Fabulous.
Thanks, Carla. When this book came out, I was working and I was in the midst of my PhD. And one of the difficulties that I was having in terms of finding Indigenous scholars that were writing about my area of interest, which is queer two-spirit, Indigenous kinds of experiences. And I think that part of the motivation for participating in the project was, and this is never, the thing is that it's not the definitive word, you know what I mean? It's also a part of my process, and that, you know, I reflect back now and I read it and I kind of go, oh, I wrote that, you know. But it's the starting place, and I think that, you know, it's just where I am kind of finding my intellectual voice and thinking about what would I have liked to have read. And in particular, you know, part of it and some of the difficulty is, how do I ground this in Indigenous knowledge? And the thing is also, because of the way academia is, you know, when you're doing your PhD, you have to produce knowledge, and you have to figure out a way of, you know, how do I talk about this when this isn't something that's very present in a lot of journals or a lot of academic texts, and most of it is written from the perspective of non-Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people looking at us. And so it's like, how do I do something that comes from inside the community, make it legible for us, and also in terms of you know, trying to sound smart.
Can you give us a little bit of a précis of what your essay is about?
So it's actually kind of like my dissertation in a nutshell, in that I'm looking at historical figures within the Indigenous community who in contemporary times we would refer to as non-binary, or actually even two-spirit, and it's one of the individuals is Hosteen Claude, who's had a fair amount written about him, and the other individual was a woman by the name of Go One Go Mohawk, who basically had this really larger-than-life career as a vaudeville actress, and she actually wrote her own plays and performed the part of the male protagonist. She traveled across the United States, Canada, and also Europe, yet nobody, you know, really has heard that much about her. And part of it is wanting to ground these identities, you know, within a history, and then looking at contemporary artists and the ways in which they are recovering in some instances or reenacting Indigenous knowledge, but then also looking at artists in particular that are focusing more on community and their work within the community. So it kind of follows that trajectory of looking at how we've kind of come from, you know, an identity, kind of an establishing identity, to working towards this idea of social justice. So that's it in a nutshell.
Rob, do you want to start to answer that by
Do you want me to just
talking a little bit about
text
what the
first?
essay is? Yes.
So as was mentioned, the text that I contributed was co-written with Heather Campbell. And there wouldn't be a text if it wasn't for Heather Campbell, because it is really rooted in her generous sharing of her experiences and insights when working at Library and Archives Canada in a temporary position, which is important. She was brought on as part of sort of a pilot program of Library and Archives Canada, which was directly responding to one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for archives to question themselves, open themselves up, and to Indigenous scholars. So they brought in 3 self-identifying Indigenous researchers to work for a couple years on in the collections, in the photographic collections. And so Heather shared her experiences there, which were at the same time that the Library and Archives Canada was drafting new policies, really aspirational policies of how to decolonize or sort of restructure in some ways. And in conversations with Heather, I think the main thing that came apparent in that was the sort of stated claims by Library and Archives Canada were very different from the experience of Indigenous archival researchers, as was her official title at the time. So this is a piece. It's not a conversation. It's a written piece that's sort of questioning what needs to happen with archives. It's basically calling for a complete overhauling and dismantling of archives as we know them in Canada. It's fairly critical, but it's rooted in this one person's experiences. And so in terms of getting to sort of what was missing when I started my research, I as a white settler scholar working a lot on archives and in archives, I suppose, in my research, I was so versed in archival theory and the sort of European academic theory of archives. And especially when I did any work, I had fellowship in a photographic archiving museum. And I felt so much uneasiness in this space, and I had so many criticisms, and they were not really welcomed, even though there just wasn't really room for them. And there was no real resources. When I would find something that was critical of how archives exist and operate, it was primarily in terms of institutions holding Indigenous cultural material, issues around repatriation, very important issues, and really important texts that I read. But nothing really that I could see on how photographs in particular of Indigenous content are treated, described, and cared for or not cared for. So that was something for me. And also, of course, there was no voice like Heather's, no experience of that was out there to consider. But of course, as this is co-written, and again, I'm a settler scholar, also thinking through it with Heather, and I'm not going to try to speak for Heather Campbell at all, but imagining when we were writing the text, I was imagining, prospective Indigenous archivists who would have something to look at that would point to barriers, existing, continuing barriers, but also, hopefully inspirational voice of somebody who had faced those barriers, and I don't know, we kind of touched on it as sort of like firepower to demand some form of equitable employment. Just this that there is somebody coming before you, to be approaching that.
We read that essay in my first class this semester, and it led to lots of debate and conversation around, can the institution be changed? And I think Jonathan's going to answer for us, not really. That's a great segue. Jonathan's essay.
I will have to read your paper because it's really, it makes me think of a couple of things. But when I did my master's degree 3 to 5 years ago, no, I'm kidding, it was 20 years ago at Laval University, there was not a lot of studies on material culture, and my professor was not really, I have to say, helpful, because he was not used to it, but also he was fighting a disease, so he was not really available. So I had to find ways to search this collection. My master's was about a Wampum Belt collection in Musée de la Civilisation in Quebec. So I had no idea where to go, where to start, so I had to innovate, I had to be creative. So when you proposed that I join this wonderful project, I had to say yes, because I looked at the table of contents and I said, oh my God, I need to be part of it. But I didn't have any material ready or new data to share, so I thought about it, and I thought maybe I could propose something really pragmatic, because as you said, theory can be something and really interesting, but at the end of the day you need to test the real, how do you say that in English, the real life. But anyway, I guess you know what I mean. So I thought I could try to provide some really pragmatic tips, ideas, and things to keep in mind when you want to research material culture. And since my master's, I work in 3 major national memory institutions, Parks Canada, Library and Archives Canada, until 2015. You were not there in 2015 yet. And then
It was Heather Campbell who was there.
And she's still there.
The co-writer.
No, she left. You'll see from the article.
Don't spoil it.
Well edited resignation letter.
And then at the CMH, Canadian Museum of History. So to me, I feel what I'm proposing is not necessarily indigenous methodology, but rather an indigenous person trying to navigate these institutions and trying to figure out how they work. So I hope, I believe my contribution has, brings this to the discussion. Because knowing how information is created, how it circulates, sometimes really erroneously, I think it's important to keep in mind while you conduct a research, a material culture research. Yeah.
So, my chapter is actually a rewrite of a chapter that first appeared in Public 54. That's the
Carla and I
yeah, yeah. So, it's called Overclock the Imagination, Mapping the Indigenous Future Imaginary. Really what it is it's sort of my attempt to come in after Grace Dillon when she wrote Walking in the Clouds, where she sort of really kind of formalized this concept of Indigenous futurism and sort of kind of mapped out sort of different kinds of Indigenous futurisms, but she's a literary scholar. So all her references were literary references. She works in science fiction and things like that. And so what I was interested in doing was doing something similar, not the same, but something similar for visual arts and media arts. Because by the time we started this project in 2000, whatever it was, the book, I don't remember what it was. Anyways, there had been, the Initiative for Indigenous Futures had been going for a couple of years, and Igloliorte and I had been doing work with Aboriginal territories in cyberspace for like 10 years at that point. And we knew that there was work that we were doing, but also that there were more and more Indigenous visual artists who were working in ways that you could think of as Indigenous futurisms. And so I wanted to find a way to kind of bring those, kind of gather together some of what we found to be really compelling examples. Do a different mapping than what Grace does. Grace's mapping is awesome, but trying to think through how, like, kind of what sort of work these different kinds of futurisms were doing, or what sort of work they could do. Because one of the things that we've been doing in our work, Igloliorte and I in particular, but all our collaborators for a long time, is thinking through, most Indigenous communities, that I deal with anyways, including my own, there's a very rich vocabulary for talking about history and tradition, so talking about the past, but not such a well-developed kind of vocabulary for talking about the future, except for instance, for in prophecy, something like that, but in sort of like pragmatic terms and everyday type of terms. So, and then also part of it was working through this term that I call the future imaginary, which again is inspired by Grace's work, but really thinking through, what does it mean to actually sort of paint pictures of the future and then get people sort of excited about them and actually mobilize so they can start trying to make those futures apparent. Yeah.
Amazing. We have questions for each of you sort of individually, and then another group question at the end. Do you want to start, Carla?
Sure. Michelle, this is for you. Your contemporary art historical work is so important to emerging generations of researchers, especially as the Indigenous queer resurgence continues to flourish and grow in significant ways that we all love to see. What are your hopes for the future of this work, and what are you seeing happening across Turtle Island?
Okay. In terms of thinking about, like I said, what I had written is actually based on, a number of other scholars, especially, in 2010, there were a number of books that came out, Sovereign Erotics, the issue on indigeneity and nationalism and sexuality. Those were really important. And like Jason, you mentioned, they were mostly focused on literary arts. And we really didn't have anything, or still, we're working towards, articles and scholarship that specifically looks at the visual arts. And I think that that's a very important conversation. I think that in terms of, the roles that artists play within our communities are actually, why I became an art historian in the first place is because I really think that it's through the arts that we understand and look towards the future and what the future will hold. And so we have to really pay attention to the arts. And so art history as a discipline, even though it's a Western discipline, still has a lot to offer in that regard. When I think about specifically, future scholarship, I really think we need to move away from trying to continually make ourselves legible to non-natives. And we need to concentrate and focus on ourselves and our communities. I think we also need to really turn towards our languages and the revitalization of our languages, because I think that that's really the core that holds the knowledge. And I think we really need to focus on the recovery of our languages, because it's so important, because our languages hold our worldviews. And I think that this is where we really need to kind of focus. And I also think that what I see, happening, across Canada and the United States, Turtle Island, is that younger scholars are looking towards the specificities of their community in terms of their gender and sexual identities. And I think that that's very important. It started out very broad with the coining of the term, Two-Spirit. That held, that's an anchor for us. But now we're coming down to this point where we're learning more, we're recovering knowledges, and actually being able to kind of be more specific in terms of that. And I think that that's what we will continue to see across the board.
And it's so much work to unpack because of all of the heteronormativity, but moreover the sort of Christian or church implications that sort of that specifically targeted things that they consider to be queer as a part of the project of colonization.
Exactly, and I think even if we were to look at our communities as we wouldn't be queer. We're made queer by settler colonialism. We're made queer. So I think that that's why we need to kind of remove and stop, focusing so much, trying to make ourselves legible outside of our own communities. I think that that's kind of where the importance, and focus on and developing and contributing to building Indigenous knowledge regarding this, and focus it on our growth. I'm not trying to make it kind of separate, but it's just at the same time, I think we're getting to this point where we spend so much energy, trying to, even in the academy, trying to make ourselves legible, trying to write ourselves in, and maybe we just don't need to bother about writing ourselves in.
I love that, and it relates to, Michelle's also speaking at the Indigenous Futures Research Center Symposium that's happening today and tomorrow as well, and you're going to talk about the exhibition that you're working towards that's related to all of this research that's coming up in 2025. You still have lots of time.
25.
Wait, is it 2024 or 2025? Do you want to just say a word about that, and then we can entice people to spend their Saturday afternoon in this room?
So actually, this is an exhibition that is held in conjunction, a partnership with the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Saskatchewan. It's also part of the Thinking Through the Museum Insight Grant. Partnership grant, sorry, yes. Partnership grant, thank you, Hannah. And it's going to be, I've titled the exhibition Love Medicine, and basically to think about how our sexuality is, part of our healing, and also to think of also joy, I'm quite old. And in terms of, I was, when the AIDS crisis was at the height, I remember that. I remember when, the organization within the Indigenous community response to that. And I think, we need to kind of remember that, but also think about joy and the generative aspects of intimacy. So that's kind of what I'm hoping the exhibition will be. It's still in the planning stages, and but it's going to be called Love Medicine.
I love that. Speaking of exhibitions, Jonathan, you spent the last couple of years collaborating on a major exhibition on wampum that opened at the Quai Branly in Paris. I actually happened to see it. I was in Paris for the first time in my life, and I walked in and you were like on the screen. And that exhibition is actually soon coming to the McCord, right?
Yeah.
Very exciting. You said on the website that the process of documenting these belts and other works can be both frustrating and rewarding because of the lack of documentation. What are some of the issues you came up against in this research, and how did you deal with it in the context of exhibiting the wampum? Because that's what your essay is all about, is like really challenging and trying to understand when historical documentation of material culture belongings is absent or missing or incorrect.
Yes, this exhibition is so exciting for me. Can you imagine? I've been searching this for 20 years, and now that I work in a very cool McCord Stewart Museum, I have full room to develop an exhibition on this. I feel it will be the peak of my career, and that perhaps I could retire after this, because everything would be boring after. But so this exhibition is actually going to Ganondagan Historical Site in March. It's opening there first, and then it will come to the McCord Stewart. And by the way, it's now McCord Stewart. This is why I keep adding Stewart. I need to put this in my mind as well. Yeah.
Okay.
So at the McCord, we have the largest wampum belt collection in a Canadian public institution. We have 13 examples. That's a lot. And my intention is to display them all. So before doing this, we did our due diligence. We tried to document them, to know where they're from, and in order to ask the original communities what they know about it, what we could say about it, and all of that. So we worked with the correspondence of David Ross McCord, the founder of the institution, who actually acquired them. He bought them from David Swan. David Swan was an individual probably from Kanesatake. And David Swan was actually going around Georgian Bay, Lake Huron, Toronto, and he was taking or buying or acquiring objects, and he sold them to McCord. Unfortunately, in the correspondence, David never says where he bought it, from who he bought it. So archival research has I call it a dead end, a cul-de-sac. We cannot go further. So I'm trying to be in contact with Kanesatake because he was from Kanesatake. I spoke with Victor Bonspiel, the Grand Chief, about the project. And I'm trying to reach with Kanawake as well. And I keep the word trying because sometimes they don't answer my emails. I'm trying to share information. I wanted to be in contact as well with Wata Mohawks in the Georgian Bay area, because if David was collecting in this area, maybe they know. And I met with a lady and her daughter about wampum belts, and they said we'll try to help. I told every wampum scholars like Marge Bruchak, Rick Hill, Alan Corbière, Darren Bonaparte, they all know what we're doing. And unfortunately, for 11 of the 13 wampum belts, we don't know where they're from. So it's really frustrating. But to me, it is part of the history of the objects. And if you want to be honest and transparent, you just have to acknowledge it, right? And to admit that sometimes we don't know. Having said that, there are two that are really well documented. One is from Wendake, where I was born, and another one from Kanesatake. And my intention is to work with these two nations and communities to actually present in properly the wampum belts that are from their nations. Also, the fact that I decided to display them all is also a way for me to engage a discussion. Like, here are the belts. First of all, you won't, well, how could I phrase it? I need to be prudent. No, it's just that sometimes I realize that, I read it in the social media, and there's like one verb that is really popular, and it's stolen, taken. When you do the history of collections, you realize that there's an indigenous agency behind the original selling. Like David Swan, did he steal all of the objects? Did McCord stole the objects? Well, he actually bought them from an indigenous individual. who stole what. Anyway, I don't want to engage into this, but anyway, my point is, if we don't display the wampum belts, we will be told, well, you're hiding our material culture. So my idea is to actually display them, to engage a discussion. If someone tells us, hey, this is my great-great-grandfather's, well, fine, finally we have an interlocutor to engage a discussion. So that's how I approach the subject. Having said that, I told the communication sector at the McGeough Stewart that we will probably have some issues with people not being happy that we display wampum belts, because if you know a bit about wampum belts, you know that it's sensitive. Some people will say they need to be displayed, they need to be explained so we remember their meaning, their message, and other people will say, no, it's sacred, religious objects, you have to hide them. So I feel we cannot please everyone. So it's a risk actually to display them all. But to me, it is worth it. To me, it's being transparent. It's being open for discussion. So that's how I will approach it. I will approach it with. I will work with communities that are known, linked to the wampum belts we display. But for the other ones, I feel that it's yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
That's perfect. Carla?
Yeah. Great, thank you so much.
This is a question for you, Reilley. You've touched on this when you were explaining the chapter, but I was just wondering, with your collaboration with Heather Campbell, who you mentioned worked as an archivist at Library and Archives Canada, and your work with photographic archives has been quite largely academic. From the conversations you had with Heather, who had very hands-on experience in the archive, did your perspective change, and in terms of your work with archives, and how did this work influence the way you think about your research?
Thank you for that question. There's a few ways I can answer that. In one sense, I think that my conversations with Heather were really enlightening and equally confirming of suspicions and criticisms that I had and feelings that I had, but that I obviously am not going to experience, the way that somebody like Heather did, working in the institution. I have never worked in an archive, but I've researched in archives, right? And I mentioned earlier, some uneasiness in these settings, and nowhere to really ground that. And so, I think it confirmed a lot of my concerns, but also just really made me think further about my right to access of certain materials, certain images, or my perceived right to access. This idea of things being researchable, knowable, without necessarily and I'm talking again specifically of photography, which is where I work. And so photographs that a lot of what came up in our discussion were photographs that are of sleeping people, photographs with no consent given to photographs that are invasive. And then exist in certain ways. And of course, we have all the conversations that come up in the text through things like description and annotation and this sort of thing, but also just the existence of images and the knowledge of where they are. I mean, it connects very much to what you were just saying about, not knowing where something comes from. There's also not knowing of something existing, for communities, and that's a really big thing. So it has changed my approach to objects or photographs a lot, because instead of looking, I've been sort of considering the institution for a long time in my research, but instead of looking necessarily at objects or photographs in terms of what they depict, when the context of their making alone, I have all sorts of questions about the life of this photograph in this place, the ongoing life of this photograph. And bigger than anything, I think just maybe because it was just such a pleasurable experience writing this with Heather, is how much more I've leaned towards collaboration, and how productive these kind of collaborations and deference to other other experiences, other people's knowledge, and what else we can bring to it. So that's been a big part.
One of the conversations that comes up in the essay is specifically around renaming a photograph and removing a slur. You know, what we now recognize as a slur, but which used to be common vernacular around an Inuit photograph. And in my class, I was talking about the example of what Wanda Manabush recently did at the AGO with the renaming of a church painting by Emily Carr to the name of the nation instead of what it was called, which was a slur, you know, the slur church. And so the thing that Wanda said about slur church, too, I know the words and I'm not going to say them. So what Wanda argued, which I think is really interesting that we talked about in class in the context of your essay, is that she said, you know, if we take that, if we understand Emily Carr to have been someone who was progressive for her time and who cared about the people that she was putting in her paintings and not removing from the painting, then we have to assume that if Emily Carr was alive today, she would be up on it. She would not want her painting to still be titled that way. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about these offensive terms in things like, would those NFB photographers from the 1950s continue to want a word that is, you know, or were they in the North doing something progressive and working in a different way as well? And I thought that's an interesting way to kind of think, to reframe that conversation as like, do we need to preserve the past in that way? Or would they today not be working in that way already? And so, you know, interesting debates, because Heather had incredible difficulty getting something. Basically what she talks about in the book is that she wanted a title, she wanted it changed and acknowledged some way, and they encouraged her to write a blog post about it, but not to change the title at all. And so that was like a very, I think, challenging circumstances for her to be in.
Yeah.
Disempowering circumstances.
Disempowering and challenging, and the only sort of bright side of that is the blog post that exists, because ultimately, she did manage to, she didn't get to call out the reasons why until later. So there's more written later, and I think that's great, and we do that in here. But she was able to give sort of so much information that wasn't allowed to be given in a title, but also there was a big question about, you know, the aspirational documents that Library and Archives Canada and some other institutions have made a talk about moving some of those terms to notes or to annotations. So you don't erase the previous slur church or what have you, but like that it is, if you really want to go looking, what was the history of what was this called before, you find it. Yeah. And but it's not the first thing you're confronted with. You don't see an image of a human being with just a label that doesn't identify this person as a human being, right? And that's where this is in the documentation, but this was not allowed to her. Ultimately, her changes are allowed in brackets. You know, in this, they're more the note than the announcement.
Yeah, and I think just that flip, you know, changing what is in the note and what is on the text.
But I love that other take that you just like provided. I think that's really true, because I think in many cases there might be people working in progressive senses for their time, but have the vocabulary of their time.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. From the past to the future. Jason, you are working on thank you, Carla. That's a nice segue. You are working on a major new research project that seeks to inform the future development of artificial intelligence with Indigenous knowledge and ontology. How did your work from this? We said you were writing through the essay that you first wrote for Julie Carla and I's special issue on Indigenous art and new media, and now you're working through this essay again, and you're of course moving on very quickly to this very exciting new field of AI. You said you had recently published that big paper on it, and you're working on some other things related to it. How does the future imaginary inform the new AI work?
Thank you. So I think of the AI work as a future imaginary. So I think that so basically what we're trying to do with the new project is called Abundant Intelligences. It hasn't been funded yet, so this is all speculative, but the grants are in. But this is a group of about 45 people from North America, across the Pacific, Australia, or actually New Zealand. The Australians weren't able to get them in quite in time, but they will be there. Mainly Indigenous people, majority Indigenous people, coming from all different kinds of disciplines, and then also a group of the AI researchers here at the Mila Quebec AI Institute. And the idea is thinking through how Indigenous knowledges are different, how they're the same and how they're different from the sorts of knowledge frameworks that drive basically the mindset out of which artificial intelligence is being developed in the mainstream right now, which is a very, sort of post-enlightenment, rational subject. The most effective use for knowledge is to allow us to exploit and extract. And so what happens when we bring in knowledges that have different priorities embedded in them? So different ways of valuing what kind of knowledge is generated and kept and then disseminated and then operationalized. So we got really great big marks on high risk. This is a huge high risk thing. Like, it's not clear that this is necessarily going to end up being a really great combination of things. And there's lots of issues around the sensitivity of Indigenous knowledge. How do we do this without Indigenous knowledge being extracted, by this industry, which is really good at extracting data, and trying to really think through all those different things. But for me, when I started, so we wrote Making Kin with Machines in 2018. And actually I wrote a piece called An Orderly Assemblage of Biases in 2015, I think, but didn't get published until 2020, where this first came up out of conversations with my PhD student, Suzanne Kite. And the whole thing is an act of imagination, meaning that, really when we started Making Kin with Machines and we went out and looked, we actually found one other thing that had been written about bringing together Indigenous knowledge and robotics, actually. And it was lead authored by a woman named Angie Abdullah, who's an Australian Aboriginal woman. And it's amazing because that was published in 2016, I think. And that was it. And then when we were working on Making Kin with Machines, so it was myself, Noelani Arista, who is Kanaka. She's now at McGill. She was at University of Hawaii at the time. Archer Pachawis, who is a Cree performance artist, and Suzanne Kite. Part of what we were talking about is like, what a stretch it seemed. Like, how do we knew something was there, they knew there was something interesting there, but like, it just seemed like such a huge chasm between sort of the Indigenous knowledge, the way Indigenous knowledge was talked about in our communities, and sort of like what was going on in artificial intelligence. And that's where we ended up talking a lot about relationality, right? So really thinking through, that's what's called Making Kin with Machines, is really thinking through how Hawaiian, Cree, and Lakota cultures go about making relations with non-humans. And like taking that as the tack for thinking through, here's this new class of non-human that may evolve someday to be something really like human-like, at least in terms of like sentience and autonomy and things like that. And so maybe we need to think about what kind of relationship we want to have with this non-human, this new non-human relative. And then, so that was like an act of imagination, but then like pulling together Indigenous Protocol and AI Working Group, the workshops that we did in Hawaii in 2019, where we got 35 Indigenous folks from all across that whole range again to come together and have the first bigger conversations like that, is again like this act of like, of kind of telling a story about what we thought might be interesting and seeing if anybody thought it was interesting and worth having more of a conversation, right? And tying it into not just the future, but also the present, right? AI is happening right now. A big reason why a lot of people showed up is because their communities are already being affected adversely by AI and some of the techniques that lie around AI. And so the danger is acute. And also we have these long histories which tell us that these sorts of technologies are going to be used against us, right? It's not like, oh my God, AI is bad. It's like, oh no, here's the next one, right? So they showed up for those very practical present reasons, but also they all showed up because they really wanted to spend time thinking about how this kind of technology could be made so that, 7 generations down the line, we can think of it as, pretend on your community as a kin, as some kind of other relationship, or just as a tool that you have a really deep relationship with. And so that's really what that was doing that imagining to think about what do we have to do now so we can get to that point, in a couple generations. and so that the technology is being designed and developed and built and then deployed by ourselves, like with our communities and with our communities as part of that. And all of that is just huge future imaginary too, because we don't have the capacity now. It's a huge thing to build large scale AI systems, but I've given us the money, 6 years from now, we might have a cohort of, Indigenous folks who can build those systems. Yeah.
What we wanted just to ask all of you wonderful folks is, what is one key takeaway from your chapter? And you all have like 100, so just choose one or two. One key takeaway from your chapter.
I guess for my chapter would be that it's incredibly fruitful to create the spaces in which people in our communities can think like long and hard and in detail about what kind of futures that they want. Because given the challenges facing our communities and all the fires that are happening daily, and all the things that people have to deal with that are more important right in the moment, it can be really difficult to find that space for people who are in it to find that space. And so there's a real value in trying to create those spaces that people will come into and spend some time doing that. That's it.
Thank you.
That's it. That's all you need to do. You're done. Don't need to read the chapter.
Me?
Yeah.
I think one thing that I think we should take away from my contribution is the importance of being very critical towards the sources of information that is in front of us. And this means no matter who produced it, and this means Indigenous or not. And I want to say, especially with this internet and social media era we are in, I'm from the pre-internet era. It's terrifying to say that, but before when I started my studies, there was internet was not really performant anyway. So, in this decolonization, indigenization movement we are in, we all agree that it's crucial that we question and challenge mainstream society and colonial institutions. We all agree on that. However, I believe there's a however. We also need to be critical towards ourselves too. We need to apply careful judgment towards our beliefs, assumptions, and the information shared by our peers. And I use an example in my chapter of a quote from Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs. And in this quote that circulates right now, we saw that in the wonderful Kent Monkman exhibition, Shame and Prejudice, and by other scholars and authors, intellectuals, and Indigenous intellectuals. And this quote actually links this residential schools project with the Holocaust in some ways, because it says the final solution of our Indian problem. And this is an invention, this is a creation. It did not, Duncan Campbell Scott said many ugly things, but he did not say that. And why I care? Well, I don't know, because I'm a historian and I like truth, I guess. And to me, spreading false information is not helping anyone, and it's not helping the truth to be told. We hear by Indigenous people, we need all of the truth to be heard and told, and I really agree on that. But by spreading false information, I believe that we're not helping our case, and we're not fully reclaiming our history. So being critical is crucial, but it also means being critical with us as well. And I think it can be hard, but being honest, transparent is also with ourselves is also part of the process, I believe.
I think that ultimately the key takeaway, or what I hope is the key takeaway from the text that Heather Campbell and I wrote, connects somewhat to actually what you were saying, Michelle, about being, nation-specific, cultural-specific, looking closely, is the argument that we make that is contentious, but that archival institutions and other institutions as well of a similar breadth need to start to sort of respect and reflect Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous education, and Indigenous experience on equal terms as academic qualifications, colonial accreditation in certain ways. We make the main point of, for instance, language requirements, right? And many of these requirements in state-run institutions, in universities, of having proficiency in French and English, and we talk about after so many years of sort of violent targeting of Indigenous languages, the thought of needing to learn a second colonial language rather than reclaiming one's potentially lost or damaged mother tongue is, I think we use the word outrageous, but there's other words we could use. But that's just something I think in terms of considering that there are different systems of education, different, and so this one is very specific. We're using Heather's experiences, and so focusing on Inuit philosophy and experience. But that is something to think about.
Oh.
Thank you, Reilley.
Yes, I just, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, what can I say? And I think, if anything, for my chapter, at one level, it's time is not linear, it's cyclical. We, to quote Leanne Simpson, we're picking up the things that we had to leave behind. And that, our nations, in order for them to be strong nations, have to include everybody. And so I'm hoping, in terms of that's what people take from this, is that, we need to celebrate everyone, and also the role that the arts play in, producing information, producing knowledge. And, that has been actually, the focus of my research is how do we as Indigenous people construct knowledge regarding gender and sexuality, and then how is this knowledge then made known in artistic and cultural production? And so I guess that's kind of in a nutshell what I would say is one of the takeaways from my chapter.
Amazing. Thank you all. This has been incredible. I want to open it up for questions.
Where is the book available?
Oh, that's a great question. So we have flyers here with a discount code on them. Unfortunately, it is a very expensive hardcover book. I don't think we'll make another book that costs. We're like, this is a book for grad students, and it's $200. And I'm sorry, it's not a book for grad students in that sense. We don't know if there's going to be a paperback copy coming out right now. There is a much less expensive digital version that you can get. We're all reading on screens now. Anyways.
We're trying to consult as many libraries as possible, in terms of especially fine arts libraries, so that they can purchase them, such as Concordia.
But it is a really fantastic text that includes many essays that are extremely culturally specific, such as a Pueblo understanding of curatorial practice, and then others that are more broadly Indigenous and bring in philosophies that cross Turtle Island. And so I think that if you're interested in purchasing the book, or you'd like to get someone to buy it for you, we do have a discount code here on these flyers. And it is available on the website right now, but we do have a 20% off code that you can take from Routledge here today. That's a great question. Thank you, Jason. Laura?
Mine's in a similar vein of Jason's, but I'm wondering, who is the book for, and what are your hopes for it? Is it a textbook? Is it an archive? I don't know. What is your goal for it?
We intended to write it and hope for it's going to be incredibly useful for current and future Indigenous students, as well as folks working in our artist gallery, in terms of cultural institutions, but mainly for, current and future students.
One of the things that we have found in our own research, when we were students, is that a lot of people have been doing theory. This is the first book for Routledge, and there's not a lot out there besides this that really focuses on methodology. But that's not to say that people haven't been advancing methodologies for a long time. For decades they have, but the Indigenous scholarship has largely been coming out of curatorial practice and museology, and so people write about the sort of end product of the work that they've done with their community, and then the exhibition catalog comes out, but it doesn't talk necessarily about all of the collaboration or the oral history or everything that led up to that project. You just kind of see the final point because everyone works so hard all the time to create these things. And so we wanted to have a space for a kind of an introduction for, they're short essays, they're like 5,000-6,000 words in the text, so that there could be a lot of them, so people could say, this is what I'm doing when I'm working on this, like this is what I'm thinking through, here's how I'm thinking about cosmology and how it relates to my work, or a variety of different methods. And so I think what's really exciting about it is that this we're hoping that it will also inspire scholars who are working this way to talk about what they're doing when they're also writing about their work, because I think it's really important for emerging scholars and curators and museum professionals to understand that there's a lot of different ways to do this work. And it is a jumping off point from decolonizing methodologies, like everything everybody does is, the kind of the idea of the 25 projects. I think that a lot of those would resonate with the things in this book.
Yeah. And we definitely acknowledge that what Heather was saying in terms of, we were able to pull this together. There's so many people who've been talking about this project for a very, very, very long time, and the need to have a kind of a compilation of real diversity in terms of many, many multiples of approaches, and that this is the first, but that we really, in our intro, also acknowledge all these trailblazers, like the reasons why we're able to do this work and the shoulders that we all are standing on, and the fact that this is going to lead hopefully to more of these types of publications, or not, and maybe they come about in a different way, kind of thinking about what Michelle was saying in terms of even making sure that knowledge transferring and sharing has purpose for the purposes of community, not necessarily for kind of the academy. So who knows what that could look like, which is really exciting.
Yeah, there are people from all over the continent in the text, but there's so many people doing really excellent work that we didn't have space for, or that left the project, and that I think that the future, there's just like lots and lots of potential for this to grow. I want to say a huge thanks to the panel. This has been an incredible conversation, and it'll be online sometime soon.
Well, thank you to you and Carla for riding herd on this and making it happen. It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.